Councilmember Harlan,
Here.
Councilmember Reynolds,
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Mar,
Here.
Mayor Stevens,
Here.
and the record will reflect that Councilmember Harper is currently absent.
No, he's here.
I'm actually here.
He's
Sorry.
here.
Councilmember Harper.
Yes, here.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we're all here, which is great. We got great staff. So we have one study session item. Madam Clerk, would you please read the title?
Yes, this is a special study session on the fiscal year 2021-2022 proposed budget study session. City
Thank you.
Manager, Ms. Farrell Harrison.
Thank you very much. And so what we're going to do, everyone, is we're going to hear from our staff, starting with our city manager, Lori Ann Farrell Harrison, and then we're going to go to the public, and members of the public, you're going to get 2 minutes. When you get to 1 minute, we'll give you a warning, and then we're going to hear from the council with our questions and any comments about the staff presentation or the materials. So without further ado, Ms. Farrell Harrison, take it away.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor Stevens, honorable council members. Very excited to be here this evening to present to you the fiscal year 21-22 proposed budget. So this today represents the culmination of months and months of work on the part of staff, working to put together a budget for you for next year, which starts on July 1st. We're really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you about the guiding principles of this budget, the specific recommendations that are contained therein. But quite frankly, more than anything else, we're just excited because this is a historic budget. So I'll start by saying that, as you know, the whole nation, the world was rocked by the coronavirus pandemic about 15 to 18 months ago, depending on where you are in the world. It changed the whole landscape for not just every single nation in the world in terms of healthcare, medicine, responding to a crisis and to a disaster, but also globally. The impacts globally and financially throughout the world have been staggering. And in the United States, it was no different. The first 2 years that we responded to the pandemic were 1920, and then of course 2021. So this budget that's before you actually represents the third year where we are still dealing with the after effects of the pandemic, even though the pandemic has only been in existence for 18 months or so. Of course, fiscal year 2019-20 was the first year that we dealt with the pandemic. It hit us in our last quarter. We put together a cost containment plan very quickly. We were able to manage that budget and balanced. I just want to thank all the department heads again and you for your leadership on that. An extraordinary job of pulling back the reins, cutting expenses, and we were able to do that without using reserves. Year 2 is the current year that we're in. And so that started July 1, ends on June 30th. And right now the projections are that we may not need to dip into reserves, but if we do, it's in the $2 million amount, maybe 4 million, but not more than that. And so very successful results there too. I think we had received council authority up to 10 million. We're not going to come anywhere close to that. And again, want to thank you, council, for your leadership on making tough decisions on containing expenses. This year, going into July 1 of 2021 through June 30th of 2022 represents the third year of addressing the pandemic, but this year is different. And where the difference lies is really in the assistance that we've been given by Congress and President Biden's American Rescue Plan. It allows for us as a city to put together a plan to start bringing back the services, bringing back staffing levels, starting to piece the puzzle back together again. And of course, our theme for this budget is charting the path to recovery. And so we're really excited about this budget. Despite what's happened with the pandemic, we're starting to slowly build back in a way that we feel is measured, is responsible, and still gives us flexibility and latitude for a couple more years in using American Rescue Plan funds and our own disaster reserves to be able to build the building blocks and the foundational structure that we need to get back to where we were, and then of course launch from there to do even greater things. There are some firsts in this budget that we'll be really excited about that Carol will get into. Of course, we have the whole leadership team here. And so just really excited about having the opportunity to share with you how we put this budget together. It does have a lot of moving parts, and so it may be a little complicated, but I'm hoping that with Carol and staff's work on this, you'll be very pleased at the end. And so always looking forward to your feedback. This is the second study session that we've had, the first one having happened on May 11th with the CIP. There'll be another study session on June 8th. So we'll have 3 study sessions and then 2 public hearings, one on June 1st, where you will not have to be adopting the budget that evening, but you will see all of the budget documents in addition to the budget book that would allow for the adoption, allowing for a second adoption, or the adoption to actually happen at the second public hearing. And then of course, if you'd like additional meetings, we can accommodate that as well. We also have planned a total of 5 meetings with our committees and commissions between Planning Commission, FIPAC, and PACs. And so looking forward to a lot of feedback tonight. We're really happy to bring this forward to you. I'm looking forward to the future. It's giving us light at the end of the tunnel, quite frankly, as staff. So hopefully it will give that to you too. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carol Molina, our extraordinary finance director.
Thank you, Lorianne. I did want to take a moment to thank all the departments and the city staff to put together this budget. It was not an easy budget to put together. Like the city manager said, it has multiple layers of strategies implemented to try to get back to where we were pre-pandemic, slowly starting to get back in a responsible fiscal way. So I did want to take a moment to thank all of the staff, and particularly the budget staff who have been here for weeks on end, weekends, and multiple hours, just to try to piece this budget here before you tonight. With that, I will start sharing my screen. And let's see. Hold on a minute. Give me a quick minute as I, do you see the PowerPoint presentation?
Not yet.
Here we go. There we go. Hopefully you can see it now. Perfect. All right, before you tonight is the 21-22 operating and capital budget for our study session discussion. As the city manager mentioned, our theme this year is charting the path to recovery. In essence, trying to start to bring back the economic recoveries back into our city, and with those, the services that the city residents are accustomed to. Before you tonight, we will be discussing the 21-22 proposed budget highlights, the 21-22 revenue highlights, expenditures overview, and the budget calendar. When we started this process back in January, the City Council held a strategic planning retreat, and at that retreat, they identified 5 strategic planning goals. Those goals guide the budget making process as we go through the fiscal analysis in order to recruit and retain high quality staff, achieve long-term fiscal sustainability, strengthen our public safety, maintain and enhance into our city's infrastructure, and diversify and stabilize our housing and community needs. In our 21-22 proposed budget, the all funds budget totals $197.9 million, a $34 million increase year over year from 2021 adopted budget. And the proposed general fund budget totals $154.4 million, a $17.8 million increase, or 13% from the current year adopted budget. I did want to take a moment to pause because these are significant increases year over year. So as the city manager already explained, the 1920 fiscal year, that last quarter was when the COVID hit. And that last quarter was when city staff had to essentially shelve all of the work in preparing the 2021 budget and start anew. And it became a cost containment budget. The current year, the 2021 budget became a cost containment to be able to get ahead of the revenue loss the city was already starting to experience in that last quarter. This increase is an increase bringing back to pre-pandemic levels. It's not 100% pre-pandemic, but it is starting to chart the recovery piece, the economic recovery piece back into what we normally would see had it not been for COVID. A quick other funds review. The total $197.9 million all funds, 78% essentially is comprised of the general fund. The general fund is the one fund in the city's coffers that is essentially not restricted. Most of our public safety expenses, general government expenses are housed here. Our other funds, our internal service funds, is essentially internal fund where we expend internal equipment, workers' compensation, general liability. That's just related to city itself costs. Our capital funds, a portion of that funds our streets, our capital projects, and so forth that you heard from Raja in the prior study session on the capital projects. And then we have a special revenue funds. And these are mostly comprised of grants and funds that the city receives that are restricted. And they're restricted for particular use. And as such, we are required by GASB to make sure that those funds are strictly outlined and held outside of the general fund and tracked accordingly. For our special revenue funds, a couple of examples are, for example, the Culture Arts Master Plan Fund. This is the fund that's brand new to the city. We created this as a result of City Council's request to fund 0.5% of our Measure Q tax towards arts. So we created this fund to start to capture the Measure Q 0.5% tax and to start helping and fully fund that first year of arts. Another fund that is a special revenue fund is our American Rescue Plan. We specifically created a special fund for the ARP so we can accurately track ARP funds and the use of that. The reason for that, as federal government and state as well, when they provide us fundings that are restricted, in essence, we have to report out what we spent those monies on. They have to comply with the guidelines and the restrictions as set forth for each of those funds. And you will see these two are brand new funds in this year's budget. Our capital project funds, so examples of these, they account for the acquisition or construction of some major capital facilities. Some funds include our TIFs, traffic impact fees, or our capital outlay fund. Capital outlay fund is the one fund that the general fund transfers to comply with the CAN. In essence, the 5% of general fund revenues as required by our ordinance for the city council to fund our capital projects. Then we have our internal service funds. These are activities that are within city departments. Examples are equipment replacement fund and our IT replacement fund. And let me go into a little bit of information on our equipment replacement fund. In this particular fund, we account for fleet, the purchase and replacement of all of our apparatus, fire apparatus, police vehicles, public services, code enforcement. They're all housed here. This fund we have identified as having a structural issue, fiscal issue. We are in the process of preparing a 3 to 5 year plan to start to address the fiscal shortfalls in this fund. We're recommending a use of undesignated fund balance of about 2.2 million in either the current year, assuming the year-end balances will provide for this and with city council direction, or we can transfer this in the next year's budget. Either way, this fund does need some fiscal recovery in essence to help shore up our fleet purchases and replacement. Our IT replacement fund is the fund that we changed the CAN for about a year ago, where we reallocated 1.5% of the CAN towards our IT infrastructure. In this fund, we are fully funding the year 2 of the IT strategic plan, of the 5-year plan. In this fund, according to the IT strategic plan, includes 2 new positions for IT, a network administrator and a program analyst, too. We're also funding funding some fire mobile data computers out of this fund in this next year. We took an additional step in the IT replacement fund. Over the years, as funds were not utilized or they were starting to set aside funding for certain large projects, such as the finance ERP, those funds fell into fund balance. We are recommending in this next year's budget to fully appropriate those funds from available fund balances to the capital and to the IT projects that they were earmarked for, which is when you'll see a little bit later on why this particular fund grew so much year over year. It's not the revenue source, it's just designating from fund balance to the proper projects so that the IT department can move forward with those projects. So to go into our 21-22 general fund revenue estimates. Our revenues for the general fund totals $151.2 million. Our largest sources of funding is our sales tax and our property tax. As you can tell from the pie chart, that's a significant amount of percentage of general fund that the city relies on. The reason that this is important is in particularly the sales tax. This is the one area that the city did experience significant reductions due to the pandemic, as well as the transient occupancy tax, in essence, the hotel tax. So you can see that dollar amount also increased year over year from the adopted budget, but significantly decreased from the normal levels that the city normally receives from the hotel tax. And I'll go into a little bit more detail in the next coming slides. So our proposed general fund revenues, we're projecting $144.6 million of recurring general fund. We're also recommending the use of $6.6 million of the ARP funds as approved by Congress to replace our revenues. So one of the key designations of the ARP is to allow for local government to backfill revenue loss. We're requesting to use 6.6 of the ARP funds for the 21-22 budget in the general fund. And we're also estimating to continue the city council authority of the original 10.7 million in the current budget, transfer that authority into the next fiscal year of about 3.2. We are going to need some flexibility into potentially, hopefully not be needing this, but we are balancing the general fund budget with that assumption in place. Of the $144.6 million, our largest share of the pie is property tax. In the property tax, year over year growth is about $5.4 million. We're estimating about $49.6 million. I take you back about a year ago when the pandemic hit and we were preparing the 2021 budget, we assumed an essential flat property tax with all of the information that was coming out at that time of unemployment, people losing their jobs and not being able to pay their mortgages. So we assumed a flat and essentially a flat property tax. That coupled with the state governor providing some flexibilities in repaying those taxes. However, as we moved into this current fiscal year and where we are standing today, that did not occur. Property taxes, as I'm sure you've all heard, is fairly strong. That housing market flourished, assuming with the construction, people staying at home, really invested more money into their homes. And as in essence, there was a larger percentage of sales in the housing market in Orange County. As a result, we are seeing the property taxes continue to grow, and we're continuing that growth into the next year. Our TOT is estimated at 5.6, an increase of a little bit under $1 million from the current year. However, the $5.6 million is nowhere close to where we used to receive TOT revenues for. We tend to receive about $8.6 million of TOT annually in the general fund. We are still recommending a slightly increase, not too much, as a result of the reopening. So June 15th, the state government will be reopening. And in conversations with Travel Costa Mesa, They are seeing their occupancy rate increasing to about 80 to 85%. They anticipate that through the summer. However, there is that lag in business travel. So conferences, conventions, all of that continues to be closed. There is not an increase of business travel at this time. As a result, we're only recommending a slight increase in our TOT based on the visitors coming to town. We are also seeing an increase in sales tax, an increase of about $5.6 million. There was, during the pandemic, an increase in sales tax over our projected adopted budget to take into account some of the items that we saw that were spending during the pandemic. Items such as luxury items, high-end vehicles, and an exponential growth in online sales, which essentially kind of put our sales tax higher than the adopted budget. So we're still continuing that growth. Included in the general fund revenues is also an estimated $2 million in the retail taxes related to the cannabis Measure Q. To move on to our general fund expenditures. Our general fund expenditures incorporates about 9.7 full-time positions, four of which are not in the general fund, essentially about 5 and a change. It assumes some fixed cost increases such as PERS. We're assuming the full can. As you may recall, in the current year, we did request City Council to waive the can so we could balance the general fund. In this 21-22 year, we are recommending to fully fund the can, essentially increasing the general fund expenditures by about $4.7 million. Reinstates the 5% compensation for employees of about $3 million. It funds all of the defunded positions as a result of the pandemic in the current year, about 17.4 positions. Increases the IT replacement fund, the 1.5% that general fund revenues that goes into the IT replacement fund increased about $200,000 and change year over year. And we are at this time recommending to continue the $4 million of vacancy factor that was adopted in the 1920 general fund budget. On our pathway to fiscal recovery. As we create a pathway to fiscal recovery, we continue funding our public safety. Public safety, both police and fire, comprise over 53% of the total general fund pie. In the police department, as you may recall, with the Measure Q cannabis staffing, we increased our sworn staffing. We're currently at 138 positions. We're also recommending to restore some of the reductions that took place in the current year as a result of the pandemic. For example, the helicopter services and some overtime. We're also requesting about $156,000 in change to store cannabis storage as a result of Measure Q coming on board, reallocating a part-time crime prevention specialist to full-time. We're also recommending that the police fleet be replaced by 7 units. And in the CIP, the police department will be seeing some carpet replacements, remodel, and an underground storage tank removal for about $1.7 million. In our fire and rescue department, we are restoring the funding for the 4 defunded firefighter positions in the current year. We're realigning some positions of 1 part-time emergency service coordinator to full-time and 2 part-time fire protection specialists to full-time. In our fleet, we are recommending to purchase a new fire pumper truck and replace a fire vehicle. And in the CIP for the fire stations, we are upgrading the HVAC unit at the fire station 2. At fire station 1, at the fire station 2, we are recommending the cost for the design of a reconstruction of that station. And in fire station 3, we're recommending some facility repairs. In our Parks and Community Services department, we're fully funding the year 1 of the Arts and Culture Master Plan. We're also creating a new arts specialist position. This position will be funded by the Measure Q Art Fund. outside of the general fund. We're also recommending to restore funding for the 94 part-time positions that were furloughed and laid off as a result of COVID, and bring back full salaries and benefits of about $100,000 in change, as well as restoring the funding for animal on-call services and other operating and special events reductions taken in the current fiscal year of about $159,000. We're also realigning a part-time maintenance worker to a part-time and a part-time recreation specialist to a maintenance worker. In the CIP portion of the Parks and Community Services Department, we are expanding the Jack Hammett Sports Park, expanding the Ketchum Limbo Park, open space master plan update funding, playground and park equipment, as well as multiple other park repairs and upgrades for about $2 million. In our non-departmental, we're restoring our promotions budget by about $164,000 that was also reduced in the current fiscal year to fund events such as Snoopy House, summer concerts, and other community promotional materials. We are also increasing our funding of homeless services by about $800,000 in change. As you may recall, this fiscal year, we opened our permanent shelter, and we also have a partnership with the City of Newport Beach that will be funding approximately $1 million a year in allowing the homeless shelter to also house approximately 20 visitors from the City of Newport Beach. In our Development Services Department, we are fully funding the 2 code enforcement officers and the assistant planner that was approved by the Measure Q staffing plan. We're restoring 3.75 full-time positions and 2 3/4 part-time positions. Examples of our plan checkers, building officials, code enforcement officers, and an assistant planner. We're also restoring some of their operating funds that were also reduced in the current fiscal year, about $333,000 in change, that will also allow for some contract staffing to backfill some of their large upcoming projects. In public services, we're adding a new active transportation coordinator, as well as a senior management analyst and an associate engineer, which will be funded by the Measure M2. We're also reallocating an executive secretary to an office specialist 2. We're realigning a part-time engineering technician to full-time and a maintenance assistant to full-time. We're also restoring funding that was reduced in the 2021 adopted budget for pressure washing, sidewalks and street repairs, sprinklers, landscaping, equipment, and overtime. In our CIP, we are also funding a community choice energy feasibility study, as well as adding more EV charging stations. For the Information Technology Department, we're fully funding year 2 of the IT strategic plan. We're restoring a vacancy attrition of $100,000. We're also restoring some of the operating expenses related to operating supplies, document imaging, and other softwares by about $100,000 in change. And we are also including some additional funding for software increases and professional services. We're also recommending in this budget to start a phase-in approach of restoring some of the 1920 adopted budget vacancy factor of about $60,000. In our recruiting and retaining our high-quality staff, we're enhancing 4 full-time positions from other funds. 2 in the information technology replacement fund, an art specialist from the Measure Q Arts, and an associate engineer from Measure 2, from M2. We're also realigning multiple general fund part-time positions to full-time, essentially a senior management analyst, an active transportation coordinator, and some part-time positions to full-time. In our city manager's office, we are recommending a new assistant city manager position, and then we are realigning multiple positions throughout the different divisions within the city manager's office. For example, in human resources, an analyst to a technician and an office specialist 2 to a secretary. In the city clerk's office, we're recommending an administrative secretary to an analyst position, and in central services, in essence, our in-house printing services, quarter of an office specialist. We are also requesting to restore the contingency of $362,000 that was also cut in the current year's budget. This budget also includes the full restoration of the 5% of staff salaries. It funds all of the 17.4 positions that were defunded as part of the current year's adopted budget. And we are also including all of the MOU labor negotiations, such as the elimination of the Tier 2 salary schedules. To put all of these changes into perspective, we wanted to provide you of a historical overview of the city's full-time employee. Pre-recession, the city had 611 full-time positions. After the Great Recession, as you can see, the city lost a significant number of full-time positions. And over the last couple of years, we're slowly starting to come back to some pre-recession levels. We are still, though, about 13% under from what we used to be before the Great Recession. In our Achieving Long-Term Fiscal Sustainability section, in the Finance Department, we're fully funding the annualized permit processing specialist as approved for Measure Q. We're restoring the funding for a senior administrative analyst that was reduced in the current year. We're also reinstating some funding for some actuarial auditing and other contractual services of about $90,000. And we're asking for $50,000 for the consulting and auditing services related to the new Measure Q retail tax. In this year's budget, we are maximizing the city's economic recovery through a multi-pronged approach to maximize our federal ARP monies, fully fund our capital fund and our IT replacement fund, and strategically use the city's general fund balance of declared disaster reserve to balance the next year's budget. All of these plans will help the city quickly come back up to speed on where we were before the pandemic hit and get us to a good footing to provide the services that city residents are accustomed to. These plans will also help the city recover economically and stay in line with the AA+ rating that Senator Ford gave us earlier this year. For the proposed budget calendar, as the city manager stated in her opening remarks, these are all of the dates we're proposing or have proposed to come to council or to a commission. As you can see, we started our deliberations with the Planning Commission on May 10th with the CIP, followed by City Council and FIPAC. Before you tonight is a study session on the proposed operating budget. We will be going to the FIPAC in a special meeting tomorrow evening. And we have an outlook of dates coming forth starting from today all the way through potentially June 15th, if needed through the end of the June, to get the budget adopted for the July 1st opening of the fiscal year. And with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you. I think what we set it up is, why don't we hear from the public first, and then we can get all of our questions and comments done after that. Madam Clerk, is there anyone from the public that wishes to speak for their 2 minutes at this time?
Yes, we do have. The first speaker will be Ralph Taboda.
Okay, now Ralph, you remember that you got to do whatever, not *9 and then star, you've already done that, I guess, and then *6, and you get 2 minutes for a study session.
Okay, thank you, Mayor and Council. I'm speaking for myself. I'm a member of Finance and Pension Committee, but I'm speaking for myself tonight. Although I think I can say that the intent or the plan for the committee is to issue a letter to council with comments and or recommendations to council before they vote on the budget, which I think is, as Carol just mentioned, is probably the second meeting in June. So let me jump to page 4. The staff report concerns the estimated revenues of 144.6 million. That's recurring revenues, but then appropriations are really the expenditures are 154. So closing that gap of 10 million, as Carol mentioned, is the basically 7 million of the rescue money and 3 million of reserves. My concern there is the rescue money in reserves, that's non-recurring. That will not happen every year. I know staff is putting some money away for rescue for the following year, 22-23, but after that, it is gone. And reserves certainly can't be used year after year. So
1 minute warning.
the concern is, where is that additional 10 million coming in the out years, the future years? Concern on the head count, the growth, it was mentioned by Carol. There's 18 full-time growth going from 512, I think, to 530. Now, some of those are part-time to full-time, but that's a big increase. And we need to know, I think, make sure that the revenue in the future years is there to sustain the head count if that head count does get approved. So I'm asking, I think from staff is owes council a forecast and FIPAC a forecast of future revenues and expenditures to make sure that long-term physical sustainability that
It's been 2 minutes
is a
now.
goal is there and secure. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so Madam Clerk, looks like we got 12 attendees. Let me see if I can figure out if any of them. I don't see anybody else.
We have one more. David
Yeah.
Martinez, please.
Okay, okay, Mr. Martinez, go right ahead.
Thank you. So as I'm sure you're all aware, this month is Mental Health Awareness Month. And after this last year, I'm sure we all know the importance of mental health. The thing is, I don't know if I'm missing something, but I don't see any money going towards mental health, towards mental health crises response teams, anything of the sort. I know that Huntington Beach and Garden Grove, I believe, are starting a pilot program, and I would like for Costa Mesa to do something similar, something that helps people and doesn't force them to do something that they really don't want to do. I would suggest that this money come from the department which is getting the largest monetary increase, which is the police department. They're getting $3 million more from the last fiscal year. And on the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, I really don't think that we should be giving the most money to the police department. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. So again, now I don't see anybody, right, Madam Clerk? No more?
Mr. Mayor, no, we have no other speakers.
Okay, then I'll close public comment. And so now it's time for the council, being that it's a study session, a little bit more informal, to ask your questions. And let's do like we did, I think, for the last one, which is everybody gets to go around and ask questions if they wish. And then once we're done, if council members want to take a second round, they can. So who wants to go first? Hey, Mayor Pro Tem Andrea Marr.
I think you all sit back and let me go first on purpose. Just teasing. Okay, so this is awesome. I think there's pretty much every possible thing I've thought about in the last 2 years has been somehow covered in some capacity, which is really fantastic. I was wondering if you can explain just for me again, the way we're using ARP funds. I think what I'm understanding is that we're using ARP funds like revenue dollars. And so to fill that gap created by the reimbursing employees, we're essentially advocating using reserve funds to do that instead of the ARP funds we had originally planned to, because we need to use ARP funds to fill the gap and on the revenue side. Am I understanding that correctly?
So in a way, yes. So keep in mind that the American Rescue Plans are restricted funds. So we can only use them for certain areas. One of the key areas in the bill states that we can use the ARP funds to backfill any cuts that the city had to undertake as a result of COVID. So essentially, all of the items that we outlined to use ARP were either operational or funding defunded positions that were reduced as a result of the COVID funds. And that's what we are recommending to use for the ARP, and as well to allow for a multi-year approach of the use of the ARP. We have until December of 2024 to utilize those dollars. And by only using about $6.6 million of those funds allows us to come back to you to strategize the out years of using those dollars.
But why consider using reserve funds instead of the remaining 6 point whatever in the second half of the ARP then?
In essence, we are hopeful that we would not have to use that $3 million. We're hopeful that we're going to continue to see the revenues come back. However, we want to be conservative and make sure that the funds that are before you tonight are self-sustaining in essence. So we're recommending the $3 million of the general fund reserves to backfill any potential need. In essence, still keeping with the line of the original 10.7, so it's not increasing the use of reserves. And in essence as well, just as a reminder, our declared disaster reserves, we can only utilize those reserves in a declared disaster, which we are currently in. So we have this opportunity to be able to use the declared disaster reserves and really save those ARP dollars for our multi-year approach as we come out of this pandemic, of the fiscal impact of this pandemic. And it provides the council as well with a lot more leeway on what they want to do with the ARP. So as we go through the Treasury guidance of what's allowable and what's not allowable, we want to come back to be able to provide you with some opportunities to enhance potentially other areas in the city that you may want to use with those funds.
I mean, it's really a policy call, to be honest. And so I think we've got two pots of funding at play that can help to make the bridge to the future. So we haven't had to dip into the declared disasters reserve or the economic uncertainties reserve yet. We may be doing that as of June 30th, 2020. Well, once we close the books in a couple of months after June 30th, 2020, we'll know better if we're going to dip into reserves at all this year, but it's certainly not up to the 10.3, I think it was, that was authorized by council. That we do know. And so we have flexibility there. And so what we're recommending is let's use the declared disaster reserves because we haven't used them yet, for one. Two, you can only use them in a declared disaster, which we're in. And what better disaster should be used to attach funds to or cost to than the declared disaster reserves? That allows us to push the ARP funding out an additional year for one more bridge. But honestly, we can do it a combination of different ways. But I
just wanted to make sure I understood what you were proposing.
I think either way we'll be well situated. We'll look at the Treasury guidance again. It's 130 pages just to see if there's any strong reason to change our recommendation to you on this. But I think there's flexibility there for sure.
Okay. Can you respond to Mr. Tabota's comments about at the end of the day, we still effectively have a deficit that may continue into the future? I know when I was first elected, I had a ton of brilliant ideas about how we might consider raising revenue, and then the pandemic put the kibosh on a lot of those. So I can see a 3-year plan by which we start looking at different alternative revenue sources, but there's nothing that I can envision we would do in the very near term to sort of continue to make up the deficit. We've got to wait for hotel taxes to come back. We've got to wait for sales tax to come back. And there's nothing that I can see us forcing in the interim. But nevertheless, a year from now, I don't want to be talking about potentially having to dip into reserves because now we've got all these employees and all these programs. So what's the long-term solution there?
I'll take this. So I think that's exactly the policy feedback that we need to hear back from you. So I can say that this really, when we said that it was a historic budget, we mean that. Never before, not even during the Great Recession, were cities ever given a bridge to sustainability that could be used over a multi-year period. That has never happened. In the Great Recession, revenues plummeted, unprecedented. I mean, just like nothing we had ever seen before. And it took 5, and in some cases, in certain categories, 10 years to recover. And so the lasting impacts of that were pretty serious in terms of service levels to the public. In this instance, we do have that bridge, and we're getting $26 million. And so our job, right, for you is to make sure that we are using the funds that we have at hand to allow us to have these building blocks and steps so that by the time we get to year 4 and year 5, we're in a sustainable position. If we continue with not restoring anything that was cut, for one, we won't be able to spend the $26 million that we received. So that's number one. So I'm not interested in sending a $26 million check back. So I think we need to program it and we need to plan it. I don't recommend that we plan it all in year 1. I think that would be fiscally irresponsible. It's coming to you with $26 million worth of restored spending and then some. So we're not recommending that. We're recommending a bridge, a little bit for this year if we need it, and then the following year, and couple that with reserves. But I'm going to warn you now, there may be one more year where we're making recommendations to use reserves. That's what they're for, and we did not need to use them in 1920. So I don't want us to be kind of victims of our own success where we manage the budget so well that now we just don't want to touch the reserves at all. So we haven't touched the reserves at this point, and if we do, it's going to be nominal, perhaps 2 million. We'll let you know if we think it's going to be more, but I mean, things are looking pretty steady. We cut this budget $20 million. And so we came in with a very conservative budget. Worst case scenario was the beginning of the pandemic. So I think it's safe to build some of this back. The other point that I wanted to make to Ralph's point, which is an excellent point, and I'm glad that he mentioned that, that's the beauty of having our 5-pack, is that all of the numbers you're seeing are versus the adopted budget. They're not versus our year-end estimates as of right now. And our adopted budget for the current fiscal year, we put that together. Those numbers were generated 15 months ago. And so we have better information now. We have a full year of the pandemic. We know that we're reopening. So those numbers, the actual numbers for revenue are much better than what we had anticipated in the adopted budget. So the gap isn't as big. And we'll be prepared to share that with 5-pack and then with you on June 1st as well. I think that's an important piece of information just to help you feel more comfortable that it's not this big of a gap. It's less of a gap because of the fact that we've already seen some growth in certain revenue streams. Not all of them. TOT for sure, not happening soon, but property tax, sales tax slowly. And so we'll have that information for you.
So regardless of the pandemic, I mean, I do worry that our costs continue to rise and our revenues do not. And so separate and apart from dipping into reserves, the ARP, anything specifically related to what's transpired over the last 14 months, I would like to start viewing what the 5-year plan is to potentially look at a small increase at TOT. I'm not advocating for sales tax increase necessarily, but like what are the avenues by which we might consider our long-term fiscal health, knowing that our costs just keep going up, right? Costs of employees keep going up, the cost of our material and equipment keep going up. And we haven't always, as a city, done a very good job of trying to recover those costs from the mechanisms by which we might, permits, fees, et cetera, nor have we ever been very open-minded about anything related to increasing revenues. And so I kind of want to, we don't have to do this in the next month, Carol, so before you look at me like, I'd like us to think about the next 5 years so that it's not a surprise to anybody. And there's no one council that has to be the bad guy and say anything about increasing TOT or whatever, right? Like we need to, as a city, sort of agree that there needs to be a long-term plan on that. So sorry, questions. When the housing element is concluded, one of the things that I'm anticipating as an outcome is additional tasks, corridor plans, et cetera. I know at one point we had talked about the importance of funding those things next year so that we can roll right out of the housing element and into that planning period to actually accomplish the things that we're going to say we're going to do in the housing element. Have we accounted for, is there any additional increase for development services, or has that been accounted for in any other way?
I can start with a response to that. We have accounted for $500,000 in LEAP grant funds which the city applied for and was awarded. So that to us is a really significant dent in what we feel are the next steps following the housing element. Certainly as we go into the next few budget years, we'll be planning more and more for those follow-up tasks. But $500,000 is what we have allocated through grant funds.
Okay, and we can use that to do, I'm just using corridor planning as the example, but specific plan work?
Yes, we specifically applied for follow-up work related to the housing element, and we included a broad description, including general plan amendments, zoning changes, and specific plan amendments.
Okay, excellent. Fleet vehicle replacement fund. Why is this always an issue? Like, is it a structural issue, or are we not? I think in the past we said we weren't funding it correctly, or we weren't using it correctly. Can you help me out on that, Carol?
Yes, you're correct, actually, on both counts. For the most part, we have a multi-million-dollar fleet that needs to be replaced. As part of the equipment replacement, there should be sufficient revenue growth to account not only for the maintenance of the fleet, but for the ongoing replacement of the fleet. Somewhere down the line, a few years ago, that there happened to be a disconnect. And as a result, the equipment fund is fiscally unsustainable at this point. So for example, in the prior years, they may have only asked for about $500,000 a fleet, but that was not essentially, that funding did not come in through. So we provide that funding in through an internal charge through all the departments. But as a result of, I'm assuming, reductions in the general fund or constraints with the general fund, that equipment fund was never managed and was never dealt with. And we're at the point right now where that fund needs to have a strategic plan moving forward. We need to be able to address those shortfalls, but we also need to address our fleet needs. So the city has, as a city this old, is going to have continual fleet needs replacement. So you have a coupled effect. One, the revenues did not come in as they should have throughout the years, but the other part of it is you have an aging fleet that really does need to be replaced, as you could see from the fire apparatus that we're recommending, as well as some of the police vehicles and so forth. So it's kind of all come to head at this point. We're recommending the use of general fund reserves for about $2.2 million, either in this year or next year, to help the fund. But we definitely need to come back to you with a more strategic approach to funding that fund on a move forward annual basis.
I would ask that we looked at that more holistically as opposed to just trying to fund it. Are there vehicles that we can lease and not own? Are there economies of scale from having a bunch of electric short range vehicles so that we're not buying as much fuel? I mean, I know that fleets are a big area of potential. Councilmember Harper can probably weigh in on this, right? A big area of potential cost savings and efficiency if we operate it correctly. And I have to think that the way that we drive vehicles as a city might have changed over the last 25 years. So I'd love to understand if there is a way that we could be working smarter and not harder on that front. And then the last thing I had is, Ms. Molina, I understand that it was more challenging than you might expect to put this budget together due to some of our aging systems and software. What's the status of the ERP? Is there additional? I didn't see anything additional in here. Is it just a matter of you having enough time to implement? Where are we at?
So over the last year, a little bit longer than a year, we have had a consultant in-house come and take a look at what our current system does and what we want it to do. They recently just wrapped up that overview about a week ago. So we're at the point where we're getting ready to meet to make sure all of the different components of what we want the system to do is actually going to be part of the RFP process. Once that happens, that RFP will go out to bid. It will take about 6 to 9 months, depending on the vendors, because it's such a huge system and it has so many components to it. It has treasury, cashiering, purchasing, accounting, budget, human resources, payroll. So there's a lot of systems going to have to talk to, including some of the public safety systems as well. It's going to take probably, I would like to say 6 to 9 months before we're even at the point of starting to manage what a potential vendor will come in. So trust me that the ERP system is something I would love to have today, but because of the magnitude of the work that's going to have to go, just to make sure we're not in this place again, that we get something that is going to last a long time, that we're going to be able to maintain, and that will do what it needs to get done for the city's financial systems. It's going to take some time.
mean, that sounds like another budget cycle using this.
Yes, we are looking at alternative, like an alternative program that will help us until we're able to bridge to onboard that financial system to help us through this, because I agree with you that this current system is constantly breaking on us and it's creating a lot of staff inefficiencies.
Okay. I mean, you tell me if there's another way or another thing we should be funding in order to make this slightly less painful for you next year. Okay, that was all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. So now let's hear from Councilmember Harper.
Thank you, Mayor Stevens. Andrea, thanks for those questions. Those are good questions. On the ARP, which sounds like it applies to me, but that's a joke. Can you? I understand it's back pay. So it's like we cut a position, then through 2024, we can use those funds to fund that position. Am I understanding that correctly?
So essentially what we can do, there's a couple of components to the ARP.
Yeah.
The first part is revenue loss. And, we can definitely provide that documentation to the Treasury Department to satisfy the revenue loss that the city has experienced as a result of the pandemic. The other part of it is to restore cuts. So we can come back and say, look, the city cut all of these positions and all of these operating costs. And as a result, it qualifies. So,
okay. So this is like the PPP loans a little bit, like you identify certain costs or revenue items. I guess the PPP loans for companies, it's just costs. But in the city's case, you could identify sales tax revenue lost and say, that's it, and tag that and you're done.
So this is the very first time in the history that there's any piece of legislation that allows to backfill revenues.
Right.
So we can backfill revenues. However, we still need to report out to the United States Department of Treasury how we're using the funds that were allocated to us. The full 26 million, we need to come back and let them know, hey, this is how we're going to be using, or this is how we're using it. We know for a fact from the bill that the restoration of cuts does comply.
And it's different from the PPE in that there is no loan repayment. But what we will need to do as a city is make sure that 2 years from now, right, we're in the position to be able to afford what we're building back in, which is why we're easing our way back into it.
I appreciate that. I'm just trying to understand. You said it's for revenue loss, but you actually have to identify a specific expense. So you have to do both.
You have to do both.
You have to do both. That makes sense. And if I cut a position, I can for the next 3 years, 4 years, say it's that position and allocate it to that. Is that what you can do?
Well, I'd have to get further guidance from the Treasury Department if we can actually tie it for a multi-year for a position, but there are so many things that we can tie it to.
Yeah. So you don't think you're going to have trouble using those funds, is what you're saying?
Yeah.
That doesn't sound like it. Okay. And I wasn't referring to the PPE. It's actually the private sector is a PPP loan, which is similar. It's very similar to what you're describing. So,
in this case, Councilmember Harper, we are receiving the funds. So we are this month expecting to receive half of the 26 million and the other half in the next 12 months.
I see. I thought Lorianne said we got it. So we're getting it. All right. Very good. What is the criteria? It's interesting. The question about the replacing the fleet, is there a set of, maybe that's what you said before about strategy, but is there a set of criteria where we replace part of the fleet every year, based on age, miles? It certainly is a safety component to that I'd want to see that done on a regular basis and not just, oh my golly, we got behind here. And it seems like it's an important priority.
So the part of the budget process, the fleet division, along with the department requests, will get together and identify those pieces of equipment that are have the highest priority to be replaced. So in essence, part of the budget process makes sure that we're identifying those pieces right away. However, part of the strategy that you just mentioned is to have a mechanism, a funding mechanism to make sure that we can replace the items that we really need to.
Yeah, I mean, there's criteria and a standard, and then it hits that criteria. It's really not a question. It's just, it's got to go in, right? But have you deferred replacing the equipment even though it met the criteria?
Correct. It's been
Okay.
deferred.
So it just got deferred as part of the, okay. And yeah, I do have comments about the diesel versus electric and renewable diesel. And I will say, I will do a plug for an industry I'm in, is that we are finding a lot of renewable diesel and biodiesels that achieve a lot of carbon neutral goals that electricity is a long time to catch up. And frankly, electric buses, electric heavy equipment, the vehicles, cost-wise are almost double, and they really take a long time. Well, they don't ever recoup the cost. And we think there's just better ways to solve it. So I just want to make that comment. The CAN expenditures, they were eliminated in the last budget year. Are they going to be caught up? Are those infrastructure costs going to get caught up in this year's budget, or are we just going back to normal?
We're fully funding the CAN this year. So in the current year, we requested.
That's my question. Did last year we didn't do anything? We're not catching it up, are we? We're not doubling up, are we?
Well, we are catching a portion of it up with the ARP. So as you may recall, a couple of council meetings ago with the first tranche of the ARP, we did recommend to set aside some of the those funds for the CAN.
How much of it are we catching up of if it was 5% spent, how much are we catching up? Do you know?
I believe from the top of my head, I think we were recommending about $2.2 million worth.
Okay, and how much
In
of the
addition
total?
to what's already in the budget today.
Okay, so how much did we not catch up?
We didn't catch up about 4 million.
About 4 million. Okay. You know, I have about 4 pages of detailed notes, and I'll just make this real simple. My last comment is a little bit like Ralph's is I'm seeing, you know, I'm seeing an increase in revenue of only about 7%. And I'm comparing that to the last full normal year, which is the 1920 year. And then I'm seeing an increase in expenditures about 12.4%. And so I have the same concern. And the other thing that I think is a really hard number to get right is your sales tax projection, which none of us probably, I wouldn't bet on either, but, and maybe you can talk about how you came up with that sales tax projection or sales tax budget, because that's a really hard number. We don't know how people's behaviors are gonna come back and the timing in which they come back. So maybe Carol, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Harper, just keep in mind that our 1920 general fund revenues were severely impacted in that last quarter. So we did experience a reduction of revenues in 1920 immediately, specifically in the TOT and our sales tax components. Those two.
About one quarter worth, do you think? Is that about what it was?
It was about a quarter worth. However,
yeah.
Keep in mind that, you know, as we move in from spring into summer, that's really one of the areas we do receive a lot of revenues for, you know, the projects and the programs over in parks. The municipal code violations also took a hit. The TOT, that immediately just the month over month, those last 3 months really took a big hit. So I caution you with the 1920, we will be coming back to you with the 18-19 revenues. And really at 18-19 revenues, we were almost at $144 million at that point of recurring.
So maybe the 18-19 is a better 64 million in sales tax, and therefore your $59 million budget, maybe that's a decrease, and maybe that seems reasonable.
Correct. So we're still assuming we're going to be growing from the current pandemic year, but not to the pre-pandemic levels yet. So we're slowly trying to come out of this recovery, and so that we're feeling comfortable with the revenues. We also contract out with HDL, who does do our sales tax analysis and goes through all of the industries and businesses in the city. And they have also, we kind of do a parallel track of the revenues for the sales tax, and we meet quarterly and our continuous meetings. They're at the same point where I am today with the $159 million in sales tax. And as we start seeing those monies start coming back.
You mean 59, Carol?
Yes, sorry.
Okay. Do you I'm not picking on you, Carol, but I want you to explain attachment 4, vacancy, attrition, and furloughs, that negative number that relates to salary. I just want to mechanically understand it again. You explained it to me once, and you can explain it to me again, and then later council can explain it to me, just as best.
So part of the fiscal year 1920 adopted budget, pre me and pre Lorianne, the budget included a vacancy attrition in 3 departments. The police department of about $3.8 million, which is a negative. The IT department and the parks department. And
I'm looking at attachment 4, just so we can be on the same page. Attachment 4, and it shows vacancy attrition 5.8 million. Carol, if I can point you to that.
Let me go ahead and open up.
Sorry about that.
It's okay.
I just want to be able to follow your numbers.
Just give me a quick minute. I didn't have this one
Sure.
quite open yet.
So Carol, that's the 2021 adopted number, is the 5 million.
Yeah,
Across.
5.8, and the 2020, 21, 22 is.
So we brought it down in 21, 22.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
5.8 in the current year.
Yeah, I'm really just looking for, Lorianne, I'm just looking for the mechanics of what that means and how it works and how it fits into the budget.
Oh, give me a quick second. Sorry, my computer's not cooperating with me today.
But Carol, you're on the right track. So in that budget, but it started in 1920, it was taken into account the fact that not every position is filled day 1 of the fiscal year throughout the entire fiscal year. And so an adjustment was made to the budget to reduce salaries. As you can see, it's in the salaries and benefits category of accounts within the chart of accounts for the city. And so it's a negative appropriation or a negative factor that basically assumes 7 to 8% of the city's entire personnel will experience some form of delay in onboarding, right? People will retire, it'll take 3 months to recruit. People may resign, it'll take 6 months to get a position on. So many government budgets will include an attrition factor. Here in Costa Mesa, it's embedded in specific departments, which is different from, I think, what we've seen in the past. And also this is a pretty significant number. So it's something that we track very, very closely just to make sure that we're tracking to that type of savings. We can say that because of retirements, which have been pretty extensive, especially this year with the pandemic and just with the demographic changes that are happening, we've been able to meet, bottom line, the budget and this vacancy factor. It would be our goal though over time to cut it back a bit.
But I don't see it, and I've never seen anything like it and that's, you've seen it before, obviously, seen it done before. Does every city do that? Not everyone.
No, not every city. In fact, large cities will do this,
Yeah.
right? They have 5,000, 6,000 employees. And so that was something that was in Long Beach. It was also when I worked for the city of New York, they had it, state of New York had it. It was put in place here by the previous finance director before we got here, but we understood the kind of the rationale behind it. Most budgets will have an attrition factor in them when they're a full service city as well, because of how long it takes to onboard public safety in particular with all the background checks and things of that nature. And so it's a natural way to reduce your appropriations without really having to cut staffing. And so it's a much more refined way of funding it. Basically what we're saying is we're going to spend 92% of the cost of every employee, knowing that at some point in time, a position might be vacant for a year, one might be vacant for a month, et cetera. And
so when I look at 1819 or 1920, there's nothing in that line item because it's not buried, but it's effectively, I mean, it's not there.
Correct.
So if I'm trying to compare 1819 and 1920 to the adopted or the proposed, I have to take those numbers, that vacancy attrition, and factor them into those numbers and then compare.
Is
that fair?
If it was showing you the 1920 adopted budget, you would see it. What you're seeing is actuals.
Of course, yeah. And I'm trying to, and Lori, I'm trying to compare an actual that I know happened to a budget that's proposed. That's just my mentality.
Right. So what you're going to see in the actual is going to be what we spent for salaries, which is going to be that much less.
Yeah, I'm sort of stating the obvious, but it makes it hard to compare.
Yeah,
And can I say I don't like it? I could say that. Is that fair? I wish we
struggle with
didn't do it.
managing it too. But I think if we showed you the 1920 adopted budget, you can see. So it's in the budget as a negative appropriation, and then the expense is somewhere else.
I believe you. I'm just, and maybe I'm making the point is I don't like it, and it makes it hard to compare numbers. And let me just say it that way. Is that fair?
That's fair.
So,
yeah.
But I understand exactly what's going on. I think I'm gonna end there. Carol, I'm gonna send you some detailed nitpicky questions. I'll do that via email and get some answers. But other than that, it's a good presentation. I made about 5 pages of notes. By the time I got done reading it, I answered most of my own questions. So I appreciate your time. So
Thank you.
thanks.
Thank you. Great question. Let's hear from Councilmember Harlan from the east side.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor. I know Arliss has had her hand up. It seems to be always receded in the background, but I'll defer to her right now.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't see that. And then we'll go to you, Councilmember Harlan. You're next.
Okay, great, thank you. It's always a tricky balance. I want to go late so my questions get answered, but the longer I wait, the more questions I come up with as I listen as well. Always happens that way. Thank you to the whole team for putting this budget together. It's clear that you've been swimming in these numbers, so it's easier sometimes, I think, to just ask the questions than to try to look up the answers. I had a few specific questions. Some of my initial ones were related to questions that Mayor Pro Tem Mar asked about sort of the long-term plan, right? Adopting these budgets and new staffing positions, sort of what does that mean in terms of our long-term commitments and expenses, and how are we addressing, or at least thinking about addressing that as we continue to recover. I'm really interested in seeing that as we further develop the budget here. I had a couple of specific questions about the Measure Q tax. So I was certainly excited to see that funding some of the special funds that we talked about just last month. But I had thought that we weren't anticipating seeing revenue from that tax immediately. Can you clarify that for me? Are we anticipating that revenue to really come in this year? And does that mean that's just going to grow and grow and grow after this year?
We're expecting the revenue to be coming in with the May revise from the state of California. Governor Newsom is, you may recall, the state has a large surplus in their capital and income tax revenues, and they're throwing a lot of money into the cannabis licensing. So we're hopeful that that means that the industry who wants to start to onboard here will come faster than we had anticipated. Originally, we were being told it was going to be about 9 months out before we can start seeing some of the industries that don't currently have a license with the state. But keeping in mind that this May revised is already programmed in with the state, as the caveat will be that the state legislature still has to pass that budget, but they are earmarking a few $1 million to bring all of the backlog for cannabis licensing quickly up to speed. That coupled with hopefully some of the vendors, the cannabis vendors who are interested coming on may already have a license or may be more ready to open up than some of those who still have to go through the state processes.
Great.
We will,
okay.
We will continue to keep an eye on that, though.
Great. Okay. So it is more optimistic than maybe we thought a month ago. Great. And is that revenue that we're able to put into the arts fund and the first-time home buyers fund, is that sort of net positive revenue offsetting the costs of the positions that we were also planning to fund with the Measure Q tax?
So those funds are special revenue funds. So we actually set up special funds for those, for the arts One, we are anticipating probably in the first year will not receive sufficient revenues to cover the full expense.
right.
However,
That's
let
right.
me make it clear that we have a request, we're proposing to fully fund the full year of expense, knowing that it's going to take a while to start expending from that fund. And as the revenues start coming in, we'll still keep an eye to make that fund fiscally balanced, with a thought process as well that in the second year, definitely, the full funding of the Measure Q will be fully in place.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, I had forgotten that we were sort of carving that off right away, and I sort of fully support that from a policy standpoint. I'm excited to get that Arts and Culture Master Plan up and running. So other question related to the sort of staffing restoration, looking forward a bit. So I know this budget, I understand this budget is restoring positions defunded in our response to the pandemic, continuing to restore some positions that we lost years ago to try to true up to the services that we're trying to provide in the city. We've also talked about the need to make adjustments to be more competitive in our recruitment. Does this include those strategies, or is that something that we still need to be addressing this year, which is another future fiscal impact, likely?
So I could answer that, Florian, if you want to as well. But this budget right now assumes where we're at today. We are eliminating the tier 2 of the salaries as the council had approved a year ago for the July 1st new proposed year. However, we are planning to slowly start coming back to you with the realignments of some of the classifications that may need to be reassessed and reviewed. Those ones are not included in the budget. What is included is that salary 2 schedule being immediately removed.
Right. And I would just add to that we are, though, including part-time to full-time transitions so that we can actually fill some of our vacant positions. In some classifications, folks will not take a part-time job in that classification. It's a professional classification. People get their graduate degree. They want a full-time job. So it stays vacant. And so we're moving to full-time in some instances. In other cases, we're downgrading positions. And in some, we're actually increasing the classification try to get to a net neutral. But at this point, nothing regarding class and comp. Once we do the classification and compensation study, we'd have to come to you with a plan about how we would implement that, and we'd have to do it slowly, in a very slow, measured pace and fashion, just to make sure that we're not overburdening the budget.
Right.
At this point, we were struggling with decisions around, do we need more people? Do we need better compensated individuals? Where do we want to be in the market recruiting talent? Do we want to be in the middle? Do we want to be slightly below the middle? I think that's about where we are now in terms of compensation citywide. Some groups are different, but overall, or do we want to be at the top tier? Those are long-term decisions, and we would have to put a plan together to achieve that. But for now, we went with bodies.
Got it. Yeah, I'm not sure which pile my strategic objectives are in all the paper on my desk, but I think that was sort of that analysis of how do we improve our competitiveness was something that we're trying to tackle this summer. So as much as we can estimate, it would be helpful to get a sense of, or maybe it's sort of a high and low, what might the range of additional fiscal impact on our salaries and benefits to improve our ability to recruit strong staff members to fill those positions. Because it sounds like we still got a bit of work. We think we probably still have a bit of work to do there. Okay, and then the IT plan. I think we get evidence every meeting that we need to continue to fund that. So I'm glad to see money going there. I no idea where that folder is. So I was curious if you could remind me where I think citywide broadband, like free Wi-Fi access, was on there somewhere. Can you remind me if you know offhand? any chance that's this year? I think this past year certainly highlighted that that's there's a real gap in internet access, and there's been a lot of discussion, I think, at the federal level and state level in terms of funding and support for increasing access to the internet. And I think that's something when we're talking about sort of recovery for our residents, that would be great to know that that's on the horizon. If you don't have that right offhand, that's fine.
I will defer to IT Director Steve Ely.
Thank you, Council Member Reynolds. We do not have any broadband in this particular one. What we do have, we're doing currently right now, we're doing some refresh of our Wi-Fi's in both PD and in City Hall. But we do have it's kind of in a TBD column in a strategic plan is a Wi-Fi study through our parks and things like that, and just looking at how we could access or, just do a study and see what we can come up with.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, maybe we can get our is it TPA, our grants team, or someone to follow closely some of the legislation around this to see if there's a way we can advance that a little bit sooner. I know it's not a time for committee updates, but I learned that all of the libraries, the Orange County Public Libraries, are planning to provide free Wi-Fi access in the vicinity of all their buildings during working hours. So I was happy to hear that. Okay. Yeah, one other sort of big picture item on the budget that I've been thinking about, we've talked about different mechanisms for revenue recovery, and one of those mechanisms is certainly fees for use or fees for services. And in many cases, I think it makes sense. I think we've talked about several examples in the past couple of years where maybe our fees are outdated or a little bit too low. In other cases, I'd like us to be thinking about where we might be able to reduce fees to provide better accessibility and be more inclusive in who can participate in some of the city programs or access some of our city facilities. So for example, we charge fees for most of the programming. Lots of people have been very excited to see the summer camps popping up for young children and for teens. But those are I think I saw $140 a week per child, or $220 a week per child, and those prices I think are cost prohibitive for a lot of our families in a normal year, and certainly in a recovery year. My understanding is that we actually used to provide some of those programs for free to our families, and I can't recall if it was on a scholarship basis or a sliding scale basis. But I'd like us to look into where we can make sure that the programs that we're offering, especially when we're using our own facilities, can be at a reduced cost for the families who need it. And this is something that we discussed on the Parks Commission a couple years ago. And I can dig up some of those notes where we proposed a few different models or looked at a few different models for that. But that's a case where, I'd rather us sort of lean towards reducing our cost recovery on those in order to make sure that we're providing services for all families in Costa Mesa, versus trying to increase fees for cost recovery purposes. Other than that, I'll just share lots of really exciting things in here. The one thing that I don't think it's missing, but I think it might be buried, and I think would be really helpful to call out a little bit more, are some of the specific items we're including in our budget to emphasize the inclusivity and vibrancy part of our mission. I don't know if Assistant City Manager Price is on the line, but I know she's really excited to sort of lean into her public health background, and she's talked about some of the social health indicators, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about the specific strategies on improving those health indicators in our city as well. But thank you so much. I'll probably have a few more questions days from now as I dig in a little bit more, but I really appreciate all of the work behind this. Thank you.
Thank you. Now the wait is over. Councilmember Harlan.
I don't know if that'll be worthwhile, but I first just want to say thank you, Ms. Molina, for you and your team putting together what I think is not just a very comprehensive budget, but one that is incredibly informative. I think we're all inclined to just kind of jump into the details of the numbers, but what I found to be particularly helpful was our community economic profile. I like to work with some data to figure out what kind of policies we want to implement. And so, it was certainly revealing that, a quarter of our population has a median household income of less than $50,000. So that gives me a little different perspective on how we might want to approach some things. I think I want to hold off on real specific questions about the budget and just kind of make some kind of bigger picture comments. I seem to share a lot of the opinions of Mayor Pro Tem Mar about kind of the context here. And I again, remember her referring to this as maybe the boring budget for this year. And I think that what we have before us is actually a good balance of some fiscal restraint, but also acknowledgement that there are things that this council wants to do, that our community wants to have done, and we're going to invest appropriately to make that happen. I think I'm going to hold off on specifics, as I said, because I really want to get some input from our FIPAC on this. I know they're going to hear it tomorrow night, and I'm glad to see that many of those committee members are watching tonight, and appreciate Mr. Tabota's comments. I really want to be able to leverage that experience and expertise for the council moving forward. And so, it's not necessarily premature that we're looking at this, but I think it's going to be helpful for me at least to get that input, because we'll get a wider community perspective. I do want to note that we obviously are looking at increasing some positions, increasing our headcount here, which I think is appropriate given all that we want to do. I am also very mindful of making sure that those are sustainable investments, that we're actually going to have some revenue ongoing that we can count on to pay for that. I also do, want to make sure that we're matching employees as far as numbers with workload. And so specifically, I look at this budget and I have some concern about in development services, whether we've got enough staffing and investment to accommodate what we're going to anticipate as far as new development, new efforts in Measure Q. So maybe Ms. Lee, hopefully you can give me some assurance you think that what we have there is enough. And I was pleased to hear your response to Mayor Pro Tem Mar's question about having funding for additional programming, because I know we are going to have to do a lot of heavy lifting after the housing element is certified.
Thank you, Councilmember Harlan. I'm happy to just opine a bit on our staffing resources analysis. We really took a very deep dive into our resources analysis of this budget cycle, and in particular looked at both our planning staffing levels as well as our building staffing levels. We've had a number of new programs that we've adopted here in the city or that we are anticipating adopting, and even more to come following the housing element. I feel very confident in this budget from a staffing perspective, particularly related to Measure Q and where we focused our efforts, particularly on staffing up our building staff resources. Certainly, we're going to continue to take a look at our long-term needs, and as things change over time, we'll be making adjustments as well. But I am confident that we've done a good job planning our resources.
Okay, and just as a follow-up, I mean, are costs recoverable in our fees? How is that structured now, and do we want to consider adjusting that if need be?
Our fees now for planning entitlements, planning applications in particular, are not 100% cost recovery. That was a policy decision made a few years ago when we updated our fees. But that's certainly something that we can speak with the city manager's office about in future budget cycles.
Okay, thank you. And my other comment tonight is about just making sure that, you know, as our primary policy document, the budget really should in some ways reflect our performance indicators, making sure that our investments are actually tied to, you know, something that we've identified as key metrics. We haven't really gotten to that point yet, but I want to kind of keep that in our mind, because I envision our budget to be in some ways like a dashboard that we can tap into and see exactly how we're performing relative to council goals. You know, one of them in particular, I'll just bring up, is economic development. I think that was sort of the theme that we were all sort of dancing around. I know we've talked a lot about it, and we actually have a specific task for this year coming up with a consultant preparing at least a plan. I definitely want to make sure we move forward with that. It seems like so much is uncertain given the last year plus, that I think we need to be as proactive as possible. Again, Mayor Pro Tem Mar talked about all of her kind of wish list in the beginning. I think it's easy to want to do that, and I share that enthusiasm. But I think we need to actually have a plan in place. So I want to make sure that we, at least if it's not directly in the budget as a line item, that we continue to talk about it, maybe make an adjustment in mid-year. And I think those are all my comments right now. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councilmember Harlan, I wanted to add just a few comments to thank you for your perspective and to your point. So in the area of development services, as Jennifer mentioned, there was a deep dive that was done. One of the things that we did in the current fiscal year was cut back significantly on positions across the board throughout all cities because of the pandemic, and we didn't have the benefit of ARP at the time. And so in development services, there were 4 full-time positions that were defunded. Those are coming back. So that's going to be a nice infusion. We had 4 part-time positions that were defunded. Those are also coming back. And then, as you may recall, we added Measure Q, staffing for development services, 2 code enforcement officers and I believe it was an associate planner. And so I think with that complement of staffing, bringing back positions that were defunded with the new dedicated to Measure Q, will be in a good place. And then we can revisit it if we think we need to turn any additional knobs. And then there's about a $240,000 restoration to contracts as well, just as a backstop. So I think we've got some redundancies built in there. I'm really hoping that Jennifer will get the support that she needs. We agree. I think we're all on the same page that we need more resources in development services. And so I'm hoping that this budget puts that forth in a way that's sustainable and really makes a lot of sense. And then to your point on the performance metrics, I love performance-based budgeting. I've done it in the past. We need software tools to help us do that. So I'm really hoping that we'll put that in our list of, you know what, and Carol, maybe this is the time to add it to our specs. And so include that in the RFP as an add-on module or something like that, that we want folks to give us pricing with and without the performance or KPIs, key performance indicators in the budget, because we can take care of that all at once. This would be the opportune time to build it in.
Okay, thank you.
Well, that was a good moment right there. We really accomplished something. I knew it was worth the wait. Councilmember Chavez.
Thank you, Mayor Stevens. Thank you, staff, for the presentation, especially Carol, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I like going last because you get to repeat a lot of things others have said. So let me just do that first, and then we can get to things that I have a few more questions on. So to follow Councilmember Reynolds, I really do agree with the reduction or some kind of metric to see how we can perhaps lower the pricing for activities for the youth during summers. I know my parents cannot afford $150 to put me in a program. And I'd argue that I was probably the age group and the demographic that probably needed the most, because I was out skateboarding instead and just causing mayhem in Costa Mesa. So just something to think about. Are we pricing out the kids we actually want to be helping out with these programs and rocks and other programs like that? Furthermore, she mentioned the internet program. Just real briefly, I know our neighbors in HB are doing a study to doing locally controlled, locally owned internet as a way to subsidize internet for lower income communities and also for the businesses. That's one way perhaps we can get another revenue stream going. As you know me, I like looking at revenue streams. That's why I push cannabis really heavily. Maybe there's one way for us to also get an internet business, but also give good rates to our businesses and homeowners and renters in Costa Mesa. To follow Councilmember Harlan's point, I appreciate our staff so much in development services. Like I really do. Like you guys have literally touched everything that I want to do on council, with cannabis, with housing, you know, with ADUs. Like you guys are the forefront, and I think you guys are doing an incredible job with the amount of staff you have, and I have full confidence in our team. I just want to reiterate that we probably should get more folks if we can, because that will make it so much better for us and easier for us to serve our community members. They're doing a great job as is. Let's just help augment that if possible. Because as we bring up cannabis, you know, as it gets more formalized, as we, you know, actually start building the housing element we're planning to build, as we start processing ADUs, the work's only going to add up. So, you know, I want to make sure that they're ready and rolling for the future. And ADUs, that's one thing I want to talk about too. So it's not really a budget discussion per se, but I know Newport Beach, for example, is you know, waiving fees to kind of incentivize folks to build ADUs. I don't know if we have the funds to, you know, not charge a fee. Obviously, we want to recoup costs. It's a really important thing for us to do, but maybe we should look at some sort of incentive for this cycle or next budget cycle, because ultimately we want to lower the cost of entry for ADUs. I have friends I know that, you know, I have friends in other cities and friends in Costa Mesa who are trying to build ADUs, and I'm seeing firsthand the difficulty that comes with actually building one. And I just think it's time for us to, like, maybe not this cycle per se, but looking forward in the future, how are we actually going to incentivize this to be something that we can do? And finally, I always want to give a shout out to IT, because they are the unsung heroes of Costa Mesa. They are making things work with a system that's really antiquated, and I just want to thank them. And I'm really appreciative that we're actually investing in the IT budget, because we want to make sure we have the appropriate stuff we need. So with that, I will get to my main point. So I think a lot of us, when we look at a budget, kind of first go to the CIP projects, because that's kind of the things that, you know, you can point and say, oh yeah, Costa Mesa built this year, Costa Mesa did that this year. And we're doing a lot this year, mainly because last year we couldn't do much because of COVID and we're being conservative. And luckily that helped us out in the long run. But I do have some concern, and I mentioned it last time, but I just want to repeat it again so we get more clarity for folks in my district and District 5. There are 3 projects in particular that are in the budget but have no actuals. That's the West Side storm drain improvements. That's the Shalimar Park improvements. And that's the Kitchen Level Park expansion. So for clarity's sake, because there are no actuals in the budget, but there's still a budget for those items, what's the timeline for those 3 things to get done? Because they're essentially really important in terms of quality of life and in terms of recreational space.
I can handle that, and then I can have Sung, you can stay on the line, and you can backfill whatever you think I've missed. And so for these projects, we still are working on, first, let's deal with Shalimar Park. So Shalimar, I know that we had once talked about Prop 68 funding potentially as a grant. Then we decided to switch gears a bit because we wanted to do a much more comprehensive plan with Think Together. And so we won't have actuals on that yet unless we switch gears to do something that's more with the footprint that we have now and not expanding the footprint. We could also do a 2-phase approach where we modernize the equipment now while we work on the expansion of the footprint, which could be a longer term project. So, you know, we're open to working with you on what the vision is for you on this, and as a council, what we'd like to do with our parks. But that's why there are no actuals yet, is basically identifying what's the plan. Is it a 2-pronged approach, mini expansion and improvement and enhancement of the playground area and what we have, and then the larger expansion later? Or do we put all our eggs in the basket of the expansion? And of course, we're trying to get as much Prop 68 funding as possible. On Ketchum Libel, we did put that in for a Prop 68 grant, and Jason's nodding his head. So we're hopeful that we'll get that. If we don't get that, then we know that we have some funding that's also been set aside for that project. And then on the West Side restoration, those funds have been appropriated. And so we're working on the plan to actually spend the funds that have been previously appropriated. But I believe that the West Side restoration plan does still have funding in the current year. We just haven't had actuals because we're working on that plan. I think we're trying to get a meeting set up with you and with Councilmember Reynolds. We've brought on a team that has specific ideas, fantastic ideas on some beautification projects. And so I think we're just trying to get that on the calendar, and we should have some actuals soon.
Okay, so two follow-up points. And first of all, thank you for clarifying. That's really good. That's why I asked the question, because I know we're doing work. It's just where we're at with the work. While Shalimar, I'll just say this now. I'm sure my council will agree with me. This is a district that needs more parks. So ideally, I would love to do a bigger plan with things together. I know it's been hard to get them on the books, and I don't want to let difficulty scheduling impact the community and not get resources. So while initially I was in favor for a longer way to do a bigger push, I think ultimately what we need is more green space and more activity space in that part of town. So I'm actually in favor of doing a two-pronged approach with the caveat that we're actually going to reach out to things together and get a plan going. So thank you for getting that clarity for me, Lorianne. And then yes, on West Side restoration, my apologies, I may have spoke too fast. I meant to say West Side storm drain improvement, so my apology there.
Well, I think I confused that. I think you did say drainage now that I, so Sung, do you want to handle the drainage question?
Yes, thank you, Madam City Manager. So Councilmember Chavez, for the West Side storm drain master plan, staff is currently working with our consultant Q3 on that at this moment. So once the design phase and plus all the plan check work that's related to that is completed, then we'll go through the CIP process and scheduling that for construction work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yang. And then my last question is there like a rough timeline for that? I know my first like week being a council member, it flooded, and I will never forget that.
All right. I know that's a sensitive issue. I would agree, Councilmember Chavez. So, but as far as the timeline, we're considering it in respect with the other CIP projects that we have, and therefore we'll create a timeline which is appropriate in which we can start on the design and construction for that project.
Okay, so we're kind of just still planning things out then, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so no timeline yet. Okay, no worries. Thank you for that. That's all I needed.
Thank you. So Councilmember Gameros, you're good? Do you wish to be heard, or are you good?
I'm good.
Okay, thank you. All right, I know we've got Mayor Pro Tem Mar that wants to talk. I just have a few questions. First of all, I just want to let everybody know it was very difficult this budget cycle because of some technology issues and some other issues, and the council was able to get the budget book over, I think it was over the weekend, and the staff report on Thursday or Friday. And staff, you worked so hard on this, and it is a really excellent product. But also I want to compliment all the city council members that you were able to dive into this so quickly and have such a meaningful dialogue about these issues. Thank you very much for doing that. I know that probably took a chunk of your weekend and even some time the last 2 days. And so that's a really good job that you did, and a lot of dedication to your job as a council member. And also to let the public know that this is just the first study session we've had on the operating budget. We, as like some of the council members said, Councilmember Harper and others, will submit written questions and we'll get answers to it. And I'm really confident that by the time we vote on this, whenever that is, that each and every council member will be fully informed about every aspect of this budget because of the staff and because of the hard work they're doing. So I just have a few questions they're kind of all over the place because I'm like filling gaps, things that were asked. A lot of my questions were asked and were really excellent questions and answers. But with respect to the disaster reserves, so as I understand it, we have, I think it's 5 years on the ARP to use that. How long, what's the tail do you think that we have to use the disaster reserves based on the pandemic? Do you have any idea? Is that obviously this year, probably next year? At what point in time do we tail off and we're unable to use those restricted reserves to address shortfalls?
Good evening, Mayor. So let me address the ARP question. We can use the ARP funds through December 31st, 2024. So we have some time, but definitely not 5 years. On the declared disasters reserves committed, you can only utilize those reserves during a declared disaster. Once the disaster is over, it's deemed over, then those funds are no longer available to be used as per how the declared disasters reserves policy is written. So in essence, for the use of those reserves will be only through the time period that we are in the disaster, which currently we still are.
Right. And then we have to wait for another disaster, which we don't want, you know. So what's that?
I think we're done with disasters.
I hope so, at least during all our terms.
So, Mr. Mayor, if I could just weigh in very quickly.
Yes, of course.
That is correct. Ms. Molina's comment is correct. You certainly could amend the policy to allow you to provide for disaster-related expenses after the end of the disaster, should you choose to do that. But as it currently is worded, our ability to use those funds is limited to it ends when the disaster ends.
Okay, very helpful. And then in terms of the equipment replacement funds, where I guess we're going to be contemplating whether we use some of our unrestricted reserves up to $2.2 million either this year or at some point in time in the future. And when I was listening to you tee that up, because you said unrestricted, presumably we cannot use disaster reserves for that purpose, even during a declared disaster. Is that right?
That's correct. The reason for that is this equipment replacement fund has been a concern for a couple of years. It is not directly related to the disaster. And as a result, those use of the declared disaster funds would not be appropriate.
And I'm sorry, I'm going to weigh in one more time, Mr. Mayor, if I may. The only exception to that would be perhaps in a different type of disaster where we had equipment that was directly damaged or destroyed, et cetera, as a result of a specific disaster. In this case, it would be probably tenuous, even though I know we may have had increased calls for service for our fire and police equipment during the pandemic. We would have to show a connection to the disaster in order to use any of those funds for equipment replacement.
Okay, I think I understand that. Thank you for that qualification. And I think that would be a little far-fetched. Okay, so I want to ask a question that has been asked by some people in public comment. I think we got a letter about this, and that is the issue of the ratio of our budget that is spent on the police department and then to some extent in the fire department. And we've got the pie chart that was presented. My question to you is, and maybe this is, it could be to Carol or to Lorianne. Where do we stack up in terms of other similarly situated cities of our size and our like cities, if you will, in terms of the ratio of our budget that's devoted to police and fire?
So Mayor, from my experience from the prior full service cities that I have worked in, 53% is pretty much the norm. It's a little bit on the lower end. I'm accustomed to 55%, maybe a little bit higher. So this is really in line with a full service city, especially a city of our age, to have this much funds from the general fund dedicated to our public safety.
Do you concur, Madam City Manager?
Absolutely. I know that in Huntington Beach, it was 55%. We just always remembered that number and we're always tracking to it. So for 10 years, we were in that 54, 55%. Once ambulance operators and lifeguard services were added to the budget for a like-to-like comparison. So that's about right. I've worked for other cities where it's 66% or 68%, getting very close to 70%. And so at that level, there is more tracking of that to ensure that there's sustainability for the budget as a whole. But I think at the 55% level, 53% where we are, we're very comfortable that we're in line.
Thank you. So this is probably one of those little questions that I could send an email, but I couldn't help but notice when we were going over the we were going over the departmental budgets and the increases to the fire department. There was a reference to needing to upgrade the HVAC system in Fire Station 1. And I know it just seems like yesterday that I went to the grand opening of Fire Station 1. So what happened to the HVAC system so quickly? And is there some way to recover on a warranty or something of that nature?
Mayor Stevens, I'll speak for Raja on this. I think what we found with the project, we had some challenges with the construction throughout the entirety of the project, which some of those areas fell into areas that we identified. I'd say within the first 6 months of the construction being completed. So we very early on worked with our legal team and worked with public services to try to identify those. We had the same concerns. And again, there were a number of issues that were not necessarily on the part of our public services, but rather some of those individuals that we contracted with. And so we have worked through that legal process to rectify those. The HVAC system was one of those.
But notwithstanding getting through all that stuff, we still have to have an expenditure to up. Is it just when it says upgrade? Is it just we want to add something to it that we didn't get when we built it, or is it a defect or something like that?
It's a little bit of both. It was a problem with the initial construct, and then it was a problem when they went in to try to fix it after the fact. And so it has to do with the moisture levels and how the HVAC system's working.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you for the explanation. So I was tickled to see that there's a special fund that is being created out of the Measure Q revenue for the arts, to fund the arts master plan. And I'm happy that that's happening. And I think we got a lot of positive comments from some of the council members about that. The other half of the percent was going to go to a first-time home buyers plan or program. And so I'm just wondering, what is the timing on that? Is that something that you think will be funded and in place and maybe even implemented sometime in this coming budget year? Or is it more realistic to do that in 22 or 23? What is the thinking about what's a realistic time frame on when before we can actually see first-time home buyers receiving assistance as a result of those revenues?
So I think Jennifer and Carol can clarify a couple of things, and then correct me if I'm wrong, but we are appropriating to get basically to get your concurrence that we want to start down this path. It will take some time to bring the first-time home buyers program back in full swing. We have basically to put all the criteria, the mechanisms in place to be able to track it and implement it on a parallel track. We'll be watching the funding. We won't make expenditures. We will not be releasing grants until we have sufficient funding to do that. But with your concurrence to start the plan, we'll track those appropriations. Nothing will be spent from those appropriations until we see that revenue coming in to flow to be able to manage it. But at least with your concurrence in adopting the budget, we'll know that we are going to proceed with starting to implement that and get all the pieces in play, and then have the accounting and the auditing and everything that we'll want to be able to sustain that program going forward as well. So Jennifer, feel free to kick in as well. And Carol, if you.
So yeah, exactly for the first time home buyers program, you will see that we have estimated some revenues coming in. However, as the city manager said, at this point, we're not allocating some expenditures to this part just because we are not quite sure how quickly and how much this fund will take fruit in this coming year. So we do have that fund set aside to start capturing those dollars and to prepare for development services to start utilizing it. So Jennifer, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. No, Lorianne and Carol, I think you hit the nail on the head. This is essentially really a starter for us in terms of re-upping that program. It was a program that we had many years ago, but haven't had for quite some time. So we'll be looking into sort of the current demographics and economics that make sense and put together the specifics of a program. I don't anticipate that these dollars, one, would be in a sufficient amount, or that we would have the detailed programs and policies in place to implement it this fiscal year. I'm looking more at next fiscal, but that's something that we'll track over time and implement it as soon as possible.
Can I ask just a quick kind of basic question about this issue? Is if you look at page 46 and 47, and I may not understand all these funds, but I can see on 46, this is of the budget, it's under special revenue funds. The first line item says right there, Arts Cultural Master Plan, and then it's got the 194. And then I don't see a corollary special fund for this first time homebuyers program. Am I missing it, or is it not there? And if it's not there, why isn't it reflected in these funds that are listed in these 2 pages?
So Mayor, these pages on 46, 47 are the appropriations. During the 21-22 proposed budget, we are not recommending to actually expend out of this money. Trust that on the revenue side, that fund is set up and ready to start capturing those dollars. However, since we're not yet prepared to start spending it, it is not on the appropriations on the yet to be expended page. We'll come back to you at the point in time, whether it's next fiscal year or mid-year, depending on how much money that fund was able to generate as a result of the Measure Q tax, to see if we're ready to embark on some of the expenditures. So that's different from the Arts Cultural Master Plan, because the Art Master Plan, we are fully funding the expense side of it, and we are recommending to move forward and to start prepping that work that's needed as per the master plan.
Oh, okay, that makes perfect sense to me. I just have three more little areas that I want to talk to you about. If you look at page 39, the line item for golf course operations, the general revenues, we went from the traditional revenues that we've had in every year that I've seen the budget are the ones that are reflected kind of the actual 2.2 million. And then I remember us, you and I, Carol, having a dialogue about what the budget number should be in 2021. Now we're all the way up to 3.5 million as the golf course revenue. And so I'm well aware from personal experience that has been a lot more play out there on the course as a result of the pandemic. But now as the things get opened up, people are going to go do some other activities. How realistic? That's an awfully large revenue number compared to the history. How realistic and how confident are you that we're going to be able to make that revenue projection?
I am fairly confident, Mayor, as how we stand today for the current fiscal year. I'm anticipating even in this current fiscal year, we may be surpassing that 3.5, but to your point directly, we did dial back a little bit on the proposed budget with that thought process that some of the use of the golf course may be going to other expenditures. So we try to essentially flatline it a little bit and reduce it just from where we're looking at in the current fiscal year. So currently fiscal year, we're trending to really be slightly over that 3.5. But as you said, it's mostly related to the pandemic and to having this as an outing for a lot of the players over at the golf course.
Right, and we did increase the rates.
Correct.
Okay, I'm going to stick with the golf course. So as we've now established that the revenues are way up. I mean, you know, even over historical numbers. And there are two references, and I remember we talked about this in our discussion of the CUP. And there are two references to the golf course in the budget. And remember, I said, just to recap, I said, it looks like it's fallen through the cracks. We don't have anything in the CUP, blah, blah, blah. And of course, it said, no, you know, wait till you get the budget. So now I look at page 35 and page 47, page 35 and page 47. One is golf course improvement fund 413. And I see we're budgeting, if I'm not mistaken, $110,000 for golf course operations. And then I also flip, and I'm not quite sure why there's two different numbers under this, but I'm sure there's a good explanation. If you flip to 265 and you look under capital projects, again, 413 is the number. You go over under public services and you have 265 there. So, I mean, what do those expenditures entail? I mean, what is planned there, and is one thing. And then the other thing is, you know, I know I'm a broken record. I've been talking about the golf course for 5 years, and who knows how much longer I will be talking about it. But to really get a assessment of what needs to be done over there, particularly with the services and the cafe and the banquet facilities and things like that I think quite obviously need to be upgraded. I mean, what should I do to engage who you know, people, the city staff, to get that kind of, get some traction on my comments that I've been making for a number of years?
John, it's my recollection that in the CIP, where we're seeing changes to facilities, we have in there the design money to start looking at an upgrade of the facility. And so I'll drill down with staff on the precise location, because there are some areas that are collapsed, some categories that are collapsed and have multiple items in them. But we are planning to go forward with a design, or at least an analysis or feasibility of doing some, you know, significant retrofits.
Okay, that's good. I appreciate that, and we'll just keep talking about it. I won't forget about it. So my second to last question is on legal fees. So we have the baseline. I think it's $1 million for the work that Jones and Mayer does, just to kind of move us forward and do all the work pertaining to the day-to-day. And then under the non-departmental for legal fees, it's 1.5 million. And this, of course, is a question for Kim Barlow. You know, when we forget about the 1 million, which I understand that's very predictable, but on the 1.5 million, to what extent have we really had our outside counsel, you know, either your firm or Cy Everett's firm, or, you know, Buckhalter for that matter, I guess there's going to be a little bit of work on there, drilled down and given us case-related budgets, so we could really understand what can we expect, and how can we manage those costs to reduce them. What's going on there in terms of forecasting and managing our legal fees?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, we have asked for those budgets. I obtained budgets from both Everett Dory and have obtained on each case as it's moved forward. In addition, I have obtained budgets on the appeals from Haynes and Boone originally, and now Buckhalter. I review those billings regularly. In fact, I have one in my pile to review for Everett Dory. It is a little, it's a little difficult because, you know, we can't always tell who's going to sue us at any given moment, but we expected those numbers to come down as the cases have moved forward. As you know, the Yellowstone case is scheduled for argument in July. We think that once that case is decided, that'll give us a much better sense of what's happening or will happen with the other appeals. Most of the other cases have been on hold. The cases that have been completed have been on hold. And so I'm trying to work with Everett Dory to reduce costs, to reduce any overlap in work between their side on cases that are currently on appeal and with Buchalter on those very same cases. So we do have those budgets. I'm happy to share them with the council. Obviously, budgets are estimates, just like our budget is. And I think Ms. Farrell Harrison and probably Ms. Molina will tell you that I'm pretty brutal about those budgets and their billings from time to time. Mr. Everett has been very gracious about it. So we're trying to keep those costs down. And at the current time, the estimate is based primarily on the fact that given that we know the Yellowstone case is going forward shortly after the beginning of the fiscal year, that's a fair estimate of what we can expect on the appeals going forward.
Okay. Okay, this is my last question, and it's kind of it's for the city manager, and it's a hard question, but whatever. Maybe it's hard, maybe it's not. What if we were to say, hypothetically, just purely hypothetically, that we don't want to take $3.2 million out of reserves this year? What would be the process that you would go through to kind of, peel back the stuff that, I mean, do you have like a list of these are my must-haves, these are my wants, or are you telling us with this budget, no, these are my must-haves? You know what I'm saying? I mean, would you have a way to reduce the size of this budget? How would you go about doing that if we just simply said, we just want a smaller envelope?
Thanks, Mayor Stevens. That's something that we've talked about as staff as well. And so I would say if we want to downsize the budget, I would say then we would take a look at, we would bring options back for you to consider, either June 1st or at the June 8th study session, where we first look at the positions that we are moving from part-time to full-time, and then some of those new positions that we're creating, and just focus on restoring the positions that were defunded. And so I think that's about 1 million in there in terms of new positions, or changing from part-time to full-time and just working with the defunded positions. Just for sake of transparency, right? Because you're making decisions based on all the feedback that you're getting. And so we probably still have some workload issues, but it would be better than now, for sure. So for one, everybody's back on the 980 schedule. We're not on the every Friday furlough schedule. So that's one good thing. We've fully funded salaries, and then bringing back 17 defunded part-time and full-time positions will help. And again, that allows us to use the ARP funding and for something legitimate that was restored that we can bring back. That I do feel strongly about, because we would be remiss to not use the ARP funds, and we can only use them for certain things. We have to prove that we need them through the revenue loss, and then we have to prove that we made cuts to actually expend it. And so we're able to meet those two goals with the restorations that we're recommending. We can take a look also at, Carol, I don't remember on the, I would hate to do this though, but just off the top of my head, we've looked at some options. Another thing would be we could look at the CAN again. In the past, we have used debt service of 2.8 million to help us meet the CAN. However, that might run us afoul of another requirement that it's unrelated to the city, and it comes from higher levels of government. So on the capital side, there's a maintenance of effort requirement that the city must comply with. We must spend a certain portion of our general fund expenses on capital infrastructure in order to get gas tax, Measure M, and other restricted funding streams for streets. So basically, the rationale is, if you're not spending it, if it's not a commitment to you, it's not a commitment to us. And so we don't want to run afoul of that. We were able to waive the CAN in the current year budget because of the fact that we were in a pandemic, and Caltrans, OCTA, they were all on board. They understood. I think the feeling now is get back to basics as much as you can. And by the way, we know you've got that nice ARP money. And so we've built the cannon full swing, but we can look at that. That would be another opportunity. I don't know if we backed out 2.8 million in infrastructure and replace it with that debt service payment for the library, if we would be meeting our maintenance of effort still. I suspect that we would not. In fact, I think that's a conversation we have with Raja. We would look at that again. And then of course, you know, we can take a look at any of the other recommendations, but cuts that we made in the current year budget, I feel strongly that it would be a shame. It would be counterproductive and counterintuitive to not restore those, because those are completely eligible for ARP and they give us that bridge. But if you'd like options, we can circle back with the team and come back with a menu of options to choose from to downsize the budget. Perhaps we come back in mid-year, perhaps we take another look. If we're doing better than expected, then we bring those on. If not, it's a little heartbreaking. Staff's been really working hard to bring this to you, but I completely understand. We went back and forth on it ourselves as well. What comes in, what comes out. And then of course, there's 3 million in asks that we receive from departments that are not included. And so Carol and I will get together. We'll go through and provide some options to you. But I think the must-haves are around, or we all must collectively do is, if we want to use the bridge that's being offered to us, then I think it behooves us to restore the things that we cut. And I think we did that just about most of it, right? And then I would offer this, since we're talking about the declared disasters, you can only use our reserves and declare disaster. We felt comfortable with that approach. Another thing that we can do is not going to reduce total spending. It would reduce which pot of funds we're using, is perhaps the furlough elimination that we did in the current year with ARP1 funds. We charged that to declare disasters, freeing up that ARP money for this year so that it's a clean. I think Carol's the only one who's shaking her head, so I think Carol's following me, but basically swapping out the declared disaster proposal for next year and with ARP, and using declared disaster for current year, which you've previously approved be used for ARP. So I think we can work at we can work through some iterations, but, and then we'll look at some other things. The contingency, for example, I always think it's important to have a contingency in the budget, but our contingency is the reserve. So I think we could bring that down if we're not comfortable building that back up. So we have some ideas, but
I don't want to break anybody's heart, but I mean, the menu metaphor is one that I'm obviously familiar with. And I think that, you know, it's like the comment that resonates with me was one that was made by Ralph Taboda and then kind of echoed or amplified by Andrea, which is a lot of these, the restoration of what we're doing, they're going to require, once we do this and once we actually fill those positions, they're going to be recurring costs that we're going to see in budget after budget. And once, I mean, you know, obviously that you know more about this than I do, that once those people are hired, then the cost associated with that, you know, person, it doesn't go down, it goes up as they're stepped and as things happen with the, from time to time with CalPERS. And so when we look and we say, okay, we had this period of time, this rather kind of a constrained period of time during which we can use our disaster reserves and then the ARP, you know, I think we need to decide right now whether the ripple effect of making those decisions and have some options to say, you know, do we, you know, we know we're going to have dinner. Do we want appetizers? Do we want dessert? What can we afford from the menu, and what can we actually eat?
And what's on the cart? Yeah.
You know, I think, and by the way, I don't want you to think that I'm one bit critical of the work that's been done here. But this is just a next iteration of analysis that might be helpful as we move forward before we vote on this. Okay, that's all I have. But at one point in time, Mayor Pro Tem Mar had her hand up. Are you good? She's good. And do any other council members want to go for seconds? Okay, to continue the metaphor. And then now we'll hear from the city manager. Before you do, I just want to say again, I cannot compliment you enough and the staff for getting this done under very difficult circumstances. And it looks like we're in a pretty good place as a result of that. So with that, do you want to make some closing remarks?
Sure. So thank you for entertaining my my metaphor there. I'm hungry and I've got delicious, my favorite cuisines waiting for me. So I would say thank you so much for just hearing us out, always being open to our recommendations. Thank you for the leadership that you've shown in the past 2 fiscal years. Quite frankly, many cities didn't take certain decisions or take certain actions, and it took courage for us to do that. In some cases, we were criticized as being too conservative or cutting too deeply, but I think we did the right thing. That's why we're in a position to actually bring these recommendations to you tonight. And so thank you for your leadership and also your support of staff's recommendations in the past. I mean, it's been a long and difficult road. I do think we're in a better place, but I do understand the concerns about building back too soon. I think we can look at some options to present to you, but I am excited about the opportunity to look forward to a path to recovery and absolutely maximize the use of the federal funds. And so really feel strongly about not giving that back. We'll also look at the multi-year plan and how we can spread that out. I think that between Carol and I and the leadership team, we'll come back with some recommendations. We will see you again on June 1st. We'll see FIPAC tomorrow, and perhaps in our dialogues with FIPAC, we can come up with some recommendations as well. So I'm looking forward to that tomorrow. And we'll get there in a way that you feel comfortable with. And so I just am thankful for the time and opportunity to share, our vision, which is basically your vision for the budget, and to be able to do some exciting things and new things while we're rebuilding and still trying to maintain fiscal conservatism. So thank you for everything tonight. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Jeannie. I think you're on here, our new budget manager as well. We have Ron Hayes and also Dustin Byrne, analysts that also participated in this. Maria Luisa is also on the call. And so thanks to all of the staff that worked so hard to put this together, and all our department heads and all of the analysts in their departments. It's a months-long effort. So just glad to be here.
Thank you very much. And you guys are all the best. And so we'll stand adjourned, and we'll reconvene for our regular meeting on June 1st, where we'll talk about other things, including, but without limitation, the budget. And so